we are going to talk tonight. It's not really a talk about Anzac Day, but it is involving the themes around Anzac Day, especially fascism in the West, in West Europe. And what was happening in and around that world, and what are the origins of fascism. Maybe if there is still an element of fascism happening today, how is it happening today if we're worried about it today? So we want to welcome to the show Professor Mark Seymour, who is from the, do you call it department? Faculty, probably, Faculty of History at the University of Otago. Mark, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Kia ora koutou. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, Mark.
Professor Mark Seymour from the University of Otago. So we'll give the audience everything. This is why someone sent me a little video, which I'm going to play part way through this conversation, which you've seen, Mark, and
Yes.
that caused me to think about the idea of fascism. We hear that word lots at the moment. You know, people used to say go woke, go broke. They're now saying go fash, lose cash, is one that I heard the other day. So this idea about the rise of fascism is in the vernacular at the moment. I guess I wanted to give us an opportunity to learn more about what it is, what it was, and maybe is it something we should be concerned about. So why don't we just start at the beginning, because you're a professor of history and you are sort of have a specialist or certainly a special area of knowledge in the origins of fascism. So we are your students, Mark. Tell us about the origins of fascism.
Oh, well, the origins of fascism as a political theory lie in 20th century Italy, and they emerged just after World War I, when Italy, like most other European countries, was in terrible disarray. Italians felt that liberal democratic politics had left them in a terrible state, and the Bolshevik revolution had just happened up in Russia, and the idea of a sort of Moscow or communist takeover was putting fear into everyone's hearts. And Benito Mussolini came up with what he thought of as he argued was a third alternative to those two main political creeds, and he called it fascism. That was his name for it. And that came from, the word fascism came from an ancient political symbol of authority, and it basically a bundle of rods or sticks wrapped around an axe with the blade protruding somewhat menacingly and tied together incredibly tightly. And it was the very antithesis of democracy and liberal individualism. It was very military in tone. It was about discipline. It was about strength in numbers, about unity, and about aggression. And he applied that sort of theory to a new politics for Italy from 1922 to 1943. So in a nutshell, a tiny nutshell.
Do we know, because I hear that picture that you're painting and I think that sounds horrific. I'd hate the leader of my country to follow that kind of idea because it sounds quite authoritarian. Do we know, were the people of Italy, were they very clear on what it actually was? Or did he kind of get in surreptitiously and then it became more of what it is? Do you know what I mean?
I do. I think that's a really interesting question, and probably both. Mussolini was inventing the ideology as he went along.
Right.
It was brand new, and I don't think he even knew. He had defected from the Socialist Party in 1915. But he was a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. He had a lot of very socialist ideas, except he was nationalistic, and socialism isn't nationalistic. Believes in the brotherhood of the working classes and so on. But fascism was violent and thuggish and authoritarian on the streets of Italy from 1919 onwards. There wasn't much hiding from that fact. So people knew, but they thought that phase might pass, that, we have to give them a chance, they need to restore order. So they sort of knew and they sort of didn't, and it's very, very hard to say exactly who knew what.
Yeah, because if you knew exactly what it was as you describe it, who would want that? Or if they did want that, if the community did want that, you have to think, what kind of state was your country in? I also just thought if you, yeah, sorry.
Well, I actually think that's really, really crucial.
Yeah.
That is really a sign that the country was in dire straits. Italy had sort of won the war, but they'd been offered a lot of land around the Eastern Adriatic if they went into the war on the side of Britain and France. They did do that. Then President Wilson came to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and said, oh, no, none of that. You're not getting anything. And people felt that, they'd lost their sons and fathers for nothing. The economy was in dire straits. The left-wing unionists were sort of getting instructions from Moscow and causing havoc. And there was this sense that the country was about to collapse, and Mussolini posed as a savior. And a bit like Trump's tariffs, oh, we have to go through a bit of pain, but, just trust me, it's all going to be fine type thing.
It is always, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a long bow here, but how often the West seems to contribute to these outcomes, which then the West has to fight back against. If you're saying that, the Americans said, no, there'll be nothing from us, and they were left a bit more destitute, I'm thinking straight away about like the CIA arming Al-Qaeda sort of thing to fight the Russians, and then it came back and they had to be used against them. It's like how much of a hand does the West have to put up for these sorts of changes in philosophy or policy of other parts of the world that then come back to bite the West?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, historians nowadays would agree that the arrangements at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I really just were a sort of waiting room for World War II. And I heard Chewie was talking about Hitler, who came to power about 11 years after Mussolini, but really on the back of the settlement that Germany had been dealt as a result of World War I.
Chewie, you ask your questions. This is your bag more than mine. I won't get in and dominate the time. Sir, it's yours.
One of the things that I was saying, hopefully you caught it while you're offline there, was that there seems to be a common parallel with how you communicate with the public, that things are going wrong, the establishment aren't doing things correctly, this is why your life sucks, and I'm the only one that knows a way out, because I'm not one of those guys. I'm not part of the establishment. Follow me, I will make things better, and then finding a scapegoat seems to be very much a pathway. Was that echoed in Italy? Was that blueprinted in Italy and then echoed in Germany later?
I think so, actually, too. Yes. The Nazi version of fascism has somehow, made Italian fascism seem relatively benign. And I suppose compared to the Holocaust, it was. But I think Mussolini really pioneered that system, and all the things you said at the beginning, you've been shafted by your government and this is why your life sucks. Trust me, I'm the one who knows. This sort of blind faith in the leader. That was a leadership and governing style that Mussolini really pioneered, and I think Hitler took a leaf straight out of his copybook. And we see similar sorts of things today, even though on average people are far, far, far better informed or have the potential to be.
Yeah, maybe we could move into the today thing. So you wrote a piece for Newsroom. We'll let people see the piece in case they want to go check it out for themselves. Q&A with you. Should we be worried about a fascism comeback? And I know that you said that Newsroom supplied the questions and then you had a limited number of words to kind of reply the answer to. But one of the questions that you were asked, that you answered, which I'd like to cover off on now, is what does fascism look like in today's world? I mean, as I said, we hear lots of buzzwords that get thrown around, whether it's Nazi or fascist or what Antifa or whatever it is. When this word gets used in 2025, fascism, what does actual fascism look like in 2025?
So I think real, genuine, historic fascism hasn't really been seen in the world since World War II. I think in the post-war years, it became a sort of byword for anyone dictatorial or authoritarian, right, with sort of right-wing tendencies. So I think it's, in a sense, that the true historic meaning of the word has been devalued, and it's used in a very generic sense. But Trump arriving on the scene has started a new sort of debate about whether this is a recrudescence of fascism. And I think that's a really interesting possibility. I thought it shows early warning signs, and that's a sort of pre-quote of your little TikTok video.
Should we do that? Should we do that now? Let's do that now, eh?
Yeah, let's.
So I came across this, someone sent this, actually someone made a comment to one of our YouTube clips, Chewie, with this and said this may be of interest. So this is a talkback host on LBC in the UK. We're going to miss the first couple of words, but she's basically saying, Nick has sent me the text and they're annoyed with how she's sort of referring to the US administration or some of the ongoings as fascism. And this is what she says.
Has texted in repeatedly to tell me how cross he is with me for describing the US administration, the current US administration, as far right. So I'm going to read for you. The Holocaust Museum displays a poster which says early warning signs of fascism. I'm just going to read them to you, and you can tell me which of these you don't think applies to Trump. Powerful and continuing nationalism, disdain for human rights, identification of enemies as a unifying cause, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, controlled mass media, obsession with national security, religion and government entwined, which is what we're talking about this hour, corporate power protected, labour power suppressed, disdain for intellectuals and the arts, obsession with crime and punishment, rampant cronyism and corruption.
So that's from the Holocaust Museum, and the question, and obviously the question the host is saying is, if we can't speak of the Trump administration in this way, if they tick all these boxes, what else is it? And look, another thing, actually, sorry, Mark, before we go on, is I wonder how many of those boxes will also be ticked by either New Zealand First or ACT. I don't think they tick all of them, but there are several in there that I kind of go, defunding RNZ, that kind of stuff. But there's a few. But there you go, Mark. That's the video that's kind of sparked this whole conversation.
Yeah. I mean, here what happens is that you find out that even though I've worn a baseball cap and a hoodie, I am actually a professor of history and I'm an academic and I'm very fussy. So you might have noticed that she began by saying, Nick is really cross with me for describing Donald Trump as far right.
Yep.
Didn't say fascism, she said far right.
True. Yep.
And then she said, here's the Holocaust Museum's definition of early warning signs of fascism. So she's already done what I said, which is conflate fascism with far right. But the other thing is that comes from a poster that was written in 2003 by a political commentator in the United States. It has nothing to do with the Holocaust Museum, except that the gift shop allegedly sold it. But she's passing it off as a really, authoritative institution's definition. It is not that. It is one business scholar's idea that, he wrote in 2003. So pardon me for sort of just investigating that document, but I needed to know what I was dealing with. I think he makes a lot of interesting points. I don't think it's a load of nonsense at all, but it is not an authoritative statement from the Holocaust Museum in the United States. What I think a definition of fascism could be much, much, much simpler than those 14 points. And I basically said that the things that distinguish fascism are its insistence on a constant national rebirth. It's what the scholar Roger Griffin called palingenetic nationalism, constant rebirth. And you could see Make America Great Again as an ideal example of that, the rebirth of something that has been somehow held back and held down by corrupt, East Coast elites. A totally religious faith in the leader to know the way. And you mentioned that, Chewie, earlier on. And I mean, you could probably say that about communism in Soviet Russia, those two things. But the other thing is that they really believe in the reinforcement of existing social hierarchies, which communism didn't. So that's a relatively simple idea, but to me, those are the distinguishing features of fascism. And looking at, say, Trump's America, I think you can see some of those things emergent. The question is whether the social structure and the institutional structure is strong enough to resist them. And if you look at Harvard fighting back and so on. There's much more fight in American institutions than there was in Italian systems in 1922.
There seems to be more fight from the institutions for this Trump term, whereas in the last Trump term, there seemed to be more fight from what they refer to as the adults in the room. There seemed to be people with Trump that were pushing back more, and now there seems to be no one with Trump. But some, as you say, Harvard, the institutions are kind of going, yeah, we're going to push back now. So,
well, they're being much more directly attacked than they were last time as well. So they have to fight back or die.
Yeah. Chewie.
Yeah, my concern with where America is at the moment is that this hasn't happened all of a sudden. It's happened very, very quickly over the past year. But this has been a process of decades. And when I think about the tendencies of fascism, the things that people cling to, it almost seems like America's been about half in the bag since before World War II, and it's almost like the way that World War II played out is postponed things. There was an excellent comment. I don't know if I actually started. No, I didn't because I'm a dummy. So sorry, whoever said it. Brilliant point. Was post World War II America did a really, really good job of making Nazism and fascism seem very, very evil. They did a very, very bad job of making it seem unappealing. So the flags, the uniforms, the rallying behind the nationality, the belief in, the oath, all of that sort of stuff, and the preeminence of their military and America's place in the world is naturally number one. All the hard work's been done. You just need someone to nudge it. And I think the Republican Party has been heading that way consciously or unconsciously for the last 40 years.
And so what you're saying is we've got a sort of perfect storm here where we now have a set of social conditions where the people are willing to go that way as well. Because obviously for the last 40 years, they haven't.
It's kind of that slow progression. Like, this is nothing to be alarmed about. This is nothing to be alarmed about. This is nothing to be alarmed about. And then you're in a place where, oh shit, this is alarming. I think there's a lot of people in the States that are looking at where they are and going, how did this happen?
All right. So, yeah, okay. Well, let's accept that. But which of you just said something about New Zealand first, answering to some of those 14 points? Think about how quickly the social fabric, the sort of compact, the Team New Zealand togetherness frayed towards the end of Jacinda Ardern's terms. I don't think you'd ever say that had been being prepared, for the last 40 years in New Zealand society. So it might be true in America, but I think these things can turn very, very quickly. They can turn on a dime, as Americans might say, even if the ground hasn't been prepared. So I'm not sure that it's been a sort of slow march towards fascism in the States for the last 40 years. I can see your argument, but I'm not ready to buy it yet, Chewie.
but equally, that was a very fast turn at the end of Jacinda Ardern's term.
Yes.
But we're not today where America is today, so we haven't then continued on. Like, I remember someone saying once in a very oversimplified way, kind of first comes patriotism, then comes nationalism, then comes fascism. And they were talking about America's in that nationalistic. We're lucky in New Zealand because we're patriotic about nothing, nowhere, never. So we're not going to worry about that chart. But America seems to be teetering on the edge of that beyond patriotism, internationalism. What's next?
So, so what I think I'm hearing from you is that you both think that America for the last 40 years has been a sort of crypto-fascist or proto-fascist, sort of waiting for the right circumstances.
I think what I wonder about America, I'm just a rodeo clown from the bottom of the South Island, but what I wonder about America is, did George W. Bush somewhat prepare the way for Donald Trump. Did Donald Trump term 1 somewhat prepare the way for Donald Trump term 2? And people keep saying, you know, this is not Reagan's Republican Party. They're equally saying in New Zealand, this is not John Key's National Party. Is there just incremental movement? You could easily argue, I guess, people on the other side might say this is not David Lange's Labour Party. Is there incremental movement always for every party in a particular direction? And are American parties on the right heading in that direction, so they're closer today than they were in the early thousands, when they were in the 80s, and there has been a creep?
I mean, as a historian, I'm a great believer in creep and increment. You know, history is one day after the other, and it's the accretion of all those hundreds of days and those gentle forces that, you know, create earthquakes. It's a bit, you know, like fault lines or something.
Yeah.
So there have been stresses on the fault lines of American society, absolutely no doubt, as Chewie says, since World War II. But something has happened, and I'm not quite sure what. I haven't been to the States. I mean, I did my PhD in the States. I lived there for several years, so I got a great sense of it as a very open, very welcoming, anything goes, be your individual self, we will pay for your education. As an amazing sort of leader of the free world, that was my experience of it. I didn't see anything like this, Chewie, coming in my 4 years of living in the United States.
And I think I'll clarify my point here a little bit as well. I'm certainly not saying that this is like a plan. I don't think that this is something that, like, if we just move very, very slowly, we can get to our goal, which is fascism. I think through a case of just democratic short-sightedness that it's happened. It's like, we've got to beat the Democrats. And this is how we're going to do it. And it's other things that have happened along the lines, like the intense militarization of their police came from a post 9/11 world. Was a big part of setting up the conditions for where they find themselves now. You know, they had all of this military equipment after the Gulf War. What do we do with it? Give it to the police. You know, there was an erosion of people's rights around how they were monitored and how they were policed and all of that
Patriot
sort of stuff.
Act.
The Patriot Act was, thank you, Pat. I was trying to grab it out of my brain and I couldn't do it. All of these things, none of these things, I think, were a conscious thing of like, that'll get us closer to fascism. I think if you pointed it out to people at the time, they would have very strenuously argued that that's absolutely not what they wanted to do. But nonetheless, it's another piece of the puzzle, and it's another tool in the tool chest for these guys that are around Trump and Trump to go, we could use this.
I was gonna say, look, I don't think Trump is ever going to make sense when you look at him in the eyes of history. But in saying that, if you buttressed Trump up against Reagan, you'd be like, what the fuck is this? But if you went Reagan, G.W. Bush, W. Bush, Trump, it still doesn't make sense. Trump still doesn't make sense. He's such an outlier, but it makes more sense of how they got there.
I'm glad Chewie mentioned 9/11. Because I think events create other events. You know, they're unforeseen shocks that can knock a party that's on course A slightly onto course B or slightly further to the right. And I think the Patriot Act was a result of that. And I think a lot of those shifts in the Republican Party after 9/11 were very much to do with that incredible shock. I left the States after my PhD about 1 week before, on the 24th of August, 2001.
Wow.
And I know the place was different when I went back there, really, really different. So I think events are really, I'm a historian, so obviously I think
that's interesting.
Things aren't planned, but you get a very, very complex combination of particular personalities, particular, as the Germans say, zeitgeist, sort of feelings of the time, particular events, and that's what historians try and unravel. We're not that great at unraveling the present.
Yeah, and look, Mark, speaking of the present, you've got a family engagement in your house, so we'll let you go with one last question, if that's okay. As a historian,
Sure.
as someone who talks about the origins of fascism, how do you see Anzac Day? What do you think of Anzac Day? How do you commemorate, remember the day that we all kind of pause and think?
Well, you're going to get me into trouble here. I see Anzac Day as a sort of nationalist ferment, and I don't like it, because I don't like nationalism and I don't like celebrating war. I fully acknowledge the sacrifice of those who go to war, but I don't like the glorification of war that's wrapped into Anzac Day. So I wouldn't say I boycott it, but it isn't something that I celebrate.
That's why I did use the word commemorate, because I think anyone who celebrates Anzac Day, that's a bit of a strange thing there as well. But look, great. Thank you for that. Appreciate your thoughts. Professor Mark Seymour, we'll let you get back to your visiting brother now from the University of Otago. Thanks so much for a really interesting chat. We appreciate your time.
Great to talk to you. Thanks for inviting me. Bye.
All the best.